Welcome back to last video before bed. Today we'll be reading creepy teacher Reddit stories. Back in high school I had a teacher, let's call her Ms. Roberts. She was our history teacher and at first she seemed like a cool, approachable teacher who genuinely cared about her students. With her bright smile and engaging lessons, she quickly became a favorite among many of us. She had a knack for making historical events feel relevant and exciting, often sharing personal anecdotes that made her relatable. But things took a creepy turn that I never saw coming. One day, while I was sitting in the back of the classroom, I overheard a couple of girls whispering about how Ms. Roberts had been having special meetings with a few select students after school. They giggled and speculated about what those meetings could be about, their eyes wide with intrigue. At first, it all sounded harmless enough, a little extra help for those struggling in class or maybe some mentorship opportunities. I dismissed it, figuring it was just another one of those things that students talked about without knowing the real details. However, I began to notice something strange. A close friend of mine, Sarah, who had always been bubbly and confident, started acting differently after one of those supposed meetings. She'd come to school looking flustered and had a nervous energy about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her bright smile had faded, replaced by a distant look in her eyes. Concerned, I asked her what was going on, and she reluctantly admitted that Ms. Roberts had pulled her aside for some one-on-one discussions about her future. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, guidance from teachers can be beneficial. But then I started hearing similar stories from other girls in our year. More of them began to talk about being called into these secret meetings with Ms. Roberts. They all said the same thing. Ms. Roberts would ask them personal questions, things that felt invasive for a teacher to inquire about, like their family lives, their dreams, and even their romantic interests. It felt odd for a teacher to be so invested in their personal lives, and the more I heard, the more my unease grew. One day after school, I decided to follow Sarah when she left for one of those meetings. My heart raced as I hid around the corner, peeking into the classroom where Ms. Roberts held her discussions. To my shock, I saw her sitting at her desk with Sarah across from her, and the atmosphere looked tense, almost charged. Ms. Roberts was leaning in closer, speaking softly, her body language unnaturally intimate for a teacher-student interaction. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, and I could sense the hairs on the back of my neck stand there about what I had seen. She broke down, her eyes brimming with tears as she admitted she felt uncomfortable with how close Ms. Roberts was getting. She mentioned that Ms. Roberts had been complimenting her a lot, telling her how special she was and how she had so much potential. The way she spoke about it sent chills down my spine. It felt more like grooming than mentoring, and my gut told me this wasn't right. We decided to take action. Sarah and I agreed that we should talk to a trusted teacher about our concerns. When I relayed what Sarah had experienced, the teacher's expression turned serious. They immediately reported it to the administration, and I could see the concern etched on their face. It was a small victory, but I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The next day, Ms. Roberts was called into the principal's office, and the atmosphere in our school shifted dramatically. Whispers filled the hallways. Students were both curious and fearful about what might happen next. Days later, we received the news. Ms. Roberts had been put on leave pending an investigation. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety wash over me. Were there others? What else had she done? As the days turned into weeks, more girls came forward, sharing their own experiences of uncomfortable meetings and inappropriate comments. Each story felt like a piece of a puzzle that revealed a disturbing picture of Ms. Roberts' behavior. Eventually, it was announced that Ms. Roberts would not be returning to our school. The relief was palpable among the students, but the lingering questions haunted me. How many other students had felt the same unease? What had been her true intentions all along? I found myself looking back at the times I had admired her enthusiasm in class, now tainted by the revelations of her actions. To this day, I still think about those secret meetings and how easily a teacher's concern can cross the line into something much darker. It serves as a haunting reminder that not all intentions are pure, especially in positions of power. If you ever feel uncomfortable in a situation like that, don't hesitate to speak up. Your voice matters. You never know who else might be feeling the same way, and together we can create a safer environment for everyone. A teacher from high school that still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. Let's call him Mr. Thompson. He was our science teacher, and while he was certainly knowledgeable about his subject, there was just something incredibly off about him that made all of us uncomfortable. From the very first day of class, Mr. Thompson had this bizarre way of interacting with students. He would stand too close when he spoke to you, leaning in with this intense gaze that felt more like an interrogation than a friendly conversation. It made you feel exposed, like he was trying to read your thoughts or something. There was a strange intensity in his demeanor that put everyone on edge. His teaching style was also unconventional. While some students appreciated his enthusiasm for science, many found his methods downright odd. He would often incorporate strange experiments that felt more like performance art than actual educational demonstrations. One time he brought in a bunch of unusual insects and insisted on letting them crawl all over his arms while explaining their anatomy. It was fascinating but also unsettling to watch. He seemed to relish the attention, and we all sat there half horrified and half intrigued. Things got weirder as the school year progressed. Mr. Thompson had a habit of sharing extremely personal stories with the class, often inappropriately. He would talk about his childhood and how he had a pet tarantula that he claimed was his best friend. He'd go on long tangents about his feelings towards spiders and how they were misunderstood creatures. While some of us enjoyed the quirky narratives, others felt it was just too much information. One day, during a class discussion, he suddenly asked a student about their biggest fear, and when they mentioned something common like heights or spiders, Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up. And he started to go on a rant about how fear was just a construct of the mind. He then proceeded to pull out a jar filled with live spiders from his desk, claiming he would help us confront our fears. The entire class erupted in panic, and several students actually left the room. It was surreal and incredibly uncomfortable. As if that wasn't enough, there were also whispers about Mr. Thompson's strange behavior outside of school. I heard rumors that he would often visit local parks and collect unusual specimens to bring to class. It was said that he had a collection of oddities, everything from preserved animal parts to bizarre plants. One time he even invited a few students to come to his private lab to see his collection, which made everyone feel uneasy. Most of us politely declined, but it was clear that he didn't understand why we were hesitant. The final straw for many of us came during a particularly bizarre science fair. Mr. Thompson had decided to showcase his experiment, involving a homemade robot that he claimed could read minds. It was a clunky contraption made of old electronics and wires, and during the demonstration he insisted that students come up one by one to interact with it. He would stand there watching intently as each student approached, and it felt like a weird performance rather than an educational experience. The level of awkwardness reached a peak when he began making exaggerated predictions about what the robot would say about each student's future, completely unscientific and utterly cringeworthy. Eventually, the administration caught wind of the discomfort surrounding Mr. Thompson's teaching methods. After numerous complaints from students and parents, he was called in for a meeting, and shortly thereafter he was placed on leave. While we were relieved, it was also a strange end to a bizarre chapter in our high school experience. Looking back, it's hard to describe the combination of fascination and discomfort that Mr. Thompson brought to the classroom. He was definitely one of those teachers you never forget, not because of the lessons he taught but because of how weird and unsettling he was. I got a story about my old teacher, Mr. Stevens. At first he seemed like a regular math teacher, but there was always something about him that felt off. He was overly friendly, often crossing boundaries that made some students uncomfortable, but I never thought much of it at first. Things started getting weird when I began to notice how he seemed to pay extra attention to certain girls in our class, particularly a few of my friends. He would linger around after class, offering unsolicited help that felt more like an excuse to chat than genuine concern for their studies. At first they appreciated the attention and the extra help, but soon the compliments escalated into something darker. One day while hanging out with my friends, I overheard them discussing how Mr. Stevens had been checking in on them outside of class. He would send them messages on social media, asking about their weekends or commenting on their posts in a way that felt overly familiar. It made me uneasy. It seemed inappropriate for a teacher to be so involved in their personal lives. Things took a turn for the worse when I learned that he had been showing up at places where several of my friends hung out. One night, a group of us went to a local cafe, and guess who was there? Mr. Stevens, sitting at a table in the corner, staring at us. My friends thought it was just a coincidence, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. He wasn't just coincidentally in the same place, he was watching us. A few weeks later, one of my friends, Lily, told us that she had seen Mr. Stevens parked outside her house multiple times. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but when it happened again, she started to feel genuinely afraid. She reported it to her parents, who advised her to tell the school. When she did, the administration seemed dismissive, chalking it up to paranoia. But Lily's fear only grew. Then things escalated even further. One day after class, Lily and I were chatting in the hallway when Mr. Stevens approached us. He seemed overly friendly, leaning in too close as he asked Lily how her family was doing. It felt invasive, and I could see the discomfort on Lily's face. I felt an urge to protect her, but I didn't know how to confront a teacher without making things worse. That night, I decided to do some digging. I started talking to other girls in our grade, and it turned out that Lily wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. Many of them had similar stories about Mr. Stevens showing up at their favorite spots, messaging them on social media, or making odd comments that felt too personal for a teacher. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just harmless behavior, it was stalking. We all agreed that we needed to take action. Together, we decided to approach the school counselor with our concerns. When we shared our experiences, the counselor's demeanor changed. She took us seriously and assured us that she would investigate. The next day, we learned that Mr. Stevens had been called in for questioning. The atmosphere in school shifted instantly. Whispers filled the hallways, and students were both curious and fearful about what might happen next. Days later, we received the news. Mr. Stevens was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The relief was palpable, but it was mixed with anxiety about what would happen next. Would he be back? Would he retaliate against any of us? As the investigation unfolded, more girls came forward, sharing their own stories of feeling watched or followed by him. The school administration finally took action, and it was announced that Mr. Stevens would not be returning to teach at our school. Although we felt a sense of justice, the experience left many of us shaken. Reflecting on it all, I still think about how easily someone in a position of authority can abuse that power. It's a haunting reminder of the importance of listening to our instincts and speaking up when something feels off. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Your voice matters, and you could be protecting not just yourself but others as well. I have a story about a relationship I had with a teacher. Let's call her Ms. Parker. She was my English teacher, and let me tell you, she was cute. I was a naive teenager, and at the time I thought it was the coolest thing ever to have a crush on a teacher. Ms. Parker was fun, charismatic, and she seemed to have a special connection with me. It all started innocently enough. She would give me extra attention in class, compliment my writing, and we'd have these deep conversations about literature. I was flattered, felt like I was her favorite student, and I reveled in it. But things quickly escalated. One day after class, she pulled me aside and started sharing personal stories, her struggles with her own life, her past relationships, and the emotional baggage she was carrying. At first, I thought it was just her being open, sharing her vulnerabilities, but looking back, it was more like trauma dumping. As the weeks went on, those conversations turned into secret meetings. We started texting each other, and eventually, it became clear that there was more than just a teacher-student relationship brewing. I was young and infatuated, and part of me felt like I was living in a movie. I mean, what teenage boy wouldn't want to be in a relationship with a cute teacher? It was thrilling and exhilarating, but deep down I knew it was wrong. We kept it a secret, meeting up after school and sneaking around like we were in some kind of forbidden romance. I felt special, but I also felt a gnawing sense of guilt. I remember her telling me about her day-to-day struggles, how overwhelming it was to be a teacher, and how lonely she felt. I was drawn in, wanting to be her confidant, but I also realized now that she was leaning on me inappropriately. As time went on, the relationship became more complicated. I found myself in a position where I was trying to support her emotionally while navigating my own teenage life. It was a lot for a high schooler to handle. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was essentially acting as her therapist instead of enjoying a normal teenage experience. I remember the thrill of being with her but also the weight of her issues hanging over me. Eventually, after a few months, things fell apart. I started to feel uncomfortable with the dynamic, especially as I realized the ethical implications of what we were doing. I was her student and she was my teacher. This wasn't right. I ended things and she seemed to take it hard, which only made me feel more guilty. I distanced myself from her and eventually I graduated and moved on. Years later, as I reflect on that relationship, I realize how messed up it really was. I was a kid and she was an adult who should have known better. I hope she's doing better now and has found healthier ways to cope with her struggles. I often wonder if she ever thinks about what happened between us and how it affected both of us. I've got a story that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. Back in my junior year of high school, I had this teacher, let's call him Mr. Harris. At first glance, he seemed like a pretty standard math teacher, strict but fair with a dry sense of humor. But there was always something about him that felt off, like he was a little too invested in his students' lives. One afternoon, after a particularly long class, I stayed behind to ask him a couple of questions about an upcoming test. As I approached his desk, I noticed his phone was sitting there, screen facing up. I could see a series of photos open on the screen, and my heart dropped when I realized they were pictures of students, specifically me and a few of my friends. I quickly glanced away, trying to play it cool, but my mind was racing. Were those taken during class? Had he been snapping candid shots while we were working? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I brushed it off and focused on my questions. Afterward, I walked out of the classroom trying to shake the unsettling feeling. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started noticing Mr. Harris lingering around after school, often working late in his classroom. He'd sometimes catch me in the hallway and make comments like, "I saw you really excel during that project." Or, "You did a fantastic job in class today." It felt like more than just a teacher's praise. It felt personal, almost invasive. One day, during lunch, I confided in my best friend about the photos I'd seen and how uncomfortable I felt. She urged me to tell someone, but I hesitated, fearing it might just be my imagination. However, the next week, during a group project, I noticed Mr. Harris was being extra attentive to me, hovering around our table and making a point to compliment my contributions. That's when I decided to take action. I gathered my courage and approached the school counselor. I explained everything, including the photos and how Mr. Harris made me feel. To my relief, the counselor took it seriously and promised to look into it. The next day, I overheard a few students talking about how Mr. Harris had been called into the principal's office. They said he seemed nervous, almost frantic. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the school was palpable. Students started whispering about Mr. Harris, speculating on what might happen next. Then one afternoon, I saw it on the school's bulletin board. A notice that Mr. Harris had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. My heart raced. I felt a mix of relief and dread. What had they uncovered about him? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some students claimed they had heard about similar incidents in the past, and others said they had seen him acting strangely around other students. Eventually, it was confirmed that he wouldn't be returning to our school. The relief was overwhelming, but the lingering questions remained. What had he done with those photos? Had he been collecting them for a while? Even now, I still think about those moments and the fear that gripped me. It's a chilling reminder of how easily the line between admiration and obsession can blur. If you're ever in a situation where something feels off, trust your instincts and speak up. Back in high school, I had this one teacher, let's call her Ms. Thompson. At first, she seemed like a typical, if slightly eccentric, English teacher. She had a way of making literature feel alive, often acting out scenes from Shakespeare with a dramatic flair. But there was always something just a bit off about her. Her eyes had a glint that seemed to linger on certain students a little too long. I brushed it off, attributing it to her unique teaching style. That was until things took a bizarre and unsettling turn. One gray morning, I walked into class to find a note taped to my desk. It was written in an elaborate flowery script that looked like it belonged in a love letter from another century. The note read, "You're such a bright star in my class. Keep shining." At first, I thought it was just a harmless compliment, maybe even part of her quirky approach to build confidence in her students. But then the notes started showing up with alarming frequency. Initially they were innocuous, "You have such a wonderful smile," or "I love your enthusiasm in class." I started to feel flattered, thinking it was just her way of encouraging me. But as the weeks went by, the tone began to shift. The notes took on an odd possessive quality that made my skin crawl. "I wish I could take you under my wing and protect you," one read, while another declared, "You're too special to be wasted on anyone else." That's when I began to sense the underlying creepiness in her words. I dismissed it, convincing myself it was just her quirky way of connecting with students, but the feeling of unease began to grow. One day she called me up to her desk after class. Her smile was wide, but her eyes seemed to glisten with something darker. She handed me a note that said, "Let's meet after school to talk about your future." My instincts screamed at me that something was off. Something deeply unsettling that I couldn't quite put my finger on. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that her intentions were anything but innocent. The next day I confided in a close friend, sharing the notes and my growing discomfort. They urged me to speak to a trusted teacher or counselor about it. Nerves twisted in my stomach, but I knew I had to take action. When I finally reported her behavior to the school administration, they took it more seriously than I expected. The principal's face grew grim as I recounted my experiences, and he assured me they would investigate the matter. As the days passed, I learned that I wasn't the only one. Several other students had similar stories, notes, strange comments, and an unsettling aura that surrounded her. The whispers in the hallways grew louder, and the air thickened with tension. Ms. Thompson was put on leave, and rumors began to swirl about her questionable behavior. Some students claimed she had been caught lingering around the school long after classes ended, peering through classroom windows. Others spoke of her giving private tutoring sessions that felt more like personal interrogations than lessons. I felt a sense of relief when I learned she would no longer be teaching us, but it was tinged with an unsettling curiosity about what had really been going on. Eventually she left the school for good, but the memories of those notes still haunt me. I still get shivers thinking about the way her handwriting twisted into something sinister. A simple compliment spiraled into an obsession. I've kept those notes tucked away in a box, a chilling reminder of how quickly admiration can turn into something much darker. In the years since, I've often wondered what happened to her. Did she move on to another school? Did she continue her eerie pattern of encouragement somewhere else? The thought sends a shiver down my spine. I can't shake the feeling that Miss Thompson's twisted affection may have found another unsuspecting student to target. In high school we had a history teacher who was just... He always seemed way too interested in our personal lives. One day he asked me about my weekend plans in front of the whole class, and when I mentioned going to a concert, he started asking for details about the venue and the band, way more than seemed appropriate. Things got weirder when he started showing up at local events and even at the concert I mentioned. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but it happened multiple times. It made me really uncomfortable, and I started avoiding talking about my personal life in class. When I brought it up to my friends, they had similar stories about him. Eventually he got let go for unrelated reasons, but those memories still give me chills. Back in high school we had a teacher named Ms. Taylor. She was our art teacher, and she was incredibly talented, passionate, and had a unique way of expressing herself through her artwork. Her classroom was filled with vibrant colors and her own pieces, which inspired many students to explore their creativity. She had a gift for connecting with students, and her lessons were often very engaging. However, there was something about her that felt off, especially when it came to her interactions with certain students. Ms. Taylor was openly lesbian, and while I fully support and respect everyone's sexuality, there came a point where her admiration for one of my classmates crossed an unsettling line. This classmate, let's call her Emily, was a straight girl who was friendly and kind to everyone, including Ms. Taylor. She was beautiful, with an infectious laugh and a warm smile that lit up the room. I think Ms. Taylor saw that beauty as a reason to develop an intense crush on her, and it quickly became evident that it was more than just admiration for Emily's artistic skills. Initially, Ms. Taylor's compliments were innocent enough, praising Emily's artwork and encouraging her to pursue her passion. However, things took a turn when Ms. Taylor started lingering around Emily's desk during class, making comments about her appearance and talent that felt overly personal. At first, Emily didn't think much of it. She appreciated the praise from a teacher she respected. But as time went on, it became clear that Miss Taylor's attention was becoming increasingly fixated on her. One day, during class, Miss Taylor decided to do a project where each student had to create a self-portrait. Emily, being the talented artist she was, poured her heart into her work, spending countless hours perfecting the details and colors. When it was time to present, Miss Taylor's reaction was unusual. She became emotional while praising Emily's portrait, saying things like, "You capture such beauty in your work. Just like you capture beauty in life." The way she looked at Emily made everyone uncomfortable, including me. I could see Emily squirming under the intensity of Miss Taylor's gaze. As the weeks passed, things started to get even weirder. Miss Taylor began inviting Emily to special sessions after school to discuss her art. Initially, Emily thought it was just an opportunity for extra help, but it quickly became apparent that it was more about Miss Taylor wanting to spend time with her. I remember one day when Emily came to me visibly shaken after one of these sessions. She explained that Miss Taylor had made comments about how much she admired Emily's spirit and how she wished she could share more of her life with her. It felt predatory, and I could see that Emily was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The breaking point came one afternoon when Miss Taylor asked Emily to come to an art show she was participating in, but she specifically wanted Emily to come alone. Emily felt uncomfortable about it and confided in me that she feared Miss Taylor might be crossing a serious line. I could see the fear in her eyes and it broke my heart. I encouraged her to tell someone, but she was afraid of ruining Miss Taylor's career or making things worse for herself. Eventually, after discussing our concerns with a few other friends who were also worried, we decided to approach a trusted teacher about the situation. We gathered our courage and explained what was happening, laying out the details of Miss Taylor's behavior. The teacher's expression turned serious and she took our concerns to heart, assuring us that she would report it to the administration immediately. The next day, Miss Taylor was called in for a meeting, and there was a noticeable tension in the air at school. We all felt a mix of hope and anxiety, wondering if we had done the right thing. Days later, we learned that Miss Taylor had been placed on leave pending an investigation. The relief that washed over us was palpable, but it was mixed with a lingering unease. We couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. How many other students had felt uncomfortable? Would there be repercussions for speaking up? As the investigation unfolded, whispers filled the hallways, and students were curious yet fearful about the outcome. Some of Emily's friends came forward, sharing their own experiences of feeling uncomfortable around Miss Taylor. It became clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. The school administration took our concerns seriously, and they began to look into Miss Taylor's behavior more closely. Eventually, it was confirmed that Miss Taylor would not be returning to our school. The announcement brought a mix of relief and sadness. I often wonder what happened to her and if she ever recognized the impact of her actions. Did she understand the boundary she had crossed? I hope she finds the help she needs to move on from her fixation and learns to set appropriate boundaries. Reflecting on this experience, I've come to realize how crucial it is to speak up when something feels wrong.